Welcome to episode 41. This is a bit of a tale of woe, really. The plan for episode 41 was to talk to you about Ferrograph reel-to-reel tape recorders, and I bought one. I now don't have one, so I figured I'll tell you the story and you can use it as maybe a small warning before you invest lots of money in a reel-to-reel tape recorder. The history of this goes back to the 1970s when I was leaving school and I went to work for a radio and electronics dealer. And in my spare time I worked at a local theatre. And we had a reel-to-reel tape recorder. That was the thing at the time. There was nothing else you could really use for professional use. So a reel-to-reel quarter-inch tape recorder it was. Stereo, half-track, and the machine that I used in the evenings at the theatre was a Ferrograph. It was a 722H. Now, in Ferrograph code words, a 722 was a Series 7 machine, pretty much a mechanical beast, but I rather liked it, built like a tank. The 722 designated it was a 2-track machine. It had built-in amplifiers, so it had two 10-watt amps, so you could plug in a pair of speakers, and we used those speakers inside the theatre. 10 watts in those days, mid-70s, was perfectly okay. So the 722H indicated that H was for high speed, so the machine would run at 3 3/4 inch per second, 7.5 inch per second, and 15 inch per second. That particular machine didn't have the limitation of 7-inch maximum spools. You could actually manage to get onto it 8 and a bit inch spools, so you could actually have a little bit more running time. And at 15 inch per second, running time sometimes was a thing you were up against. So Ferrograph never went as far as the common European standard and used in America, 10-inch spools. Never got that big. Always the usual 3 little pin movie style spools, and it worked pretty well. Now, the 722H that I had was a little bit of an unusual machine. At the time, here in the UK, we had Ferrograph, tried and tested British product, and we had another firm called Brunel, or as many people call them, Brennells, and they had similar machines. We did have the European machines, so essentially the Swiss sort of Studers, the Revoxes, they just weren't as common. There were a few EMI machines that I'd come across, but in essence, most people would just, if you wanted a sort of professional tape recorder, you'd probably end up with a Ferrograph. It seemed to be a bit of a standard. It was a very mechanical machine. It had lots of rubber drive belts, idler wheels, big heavy flywheels, so you had decent speed stability. They were 3-head machines, so there was a raise head, record head, and a playback head. Being 2-track, you could switch them between the upper or the lower track, which meant that if you were clever, you could record with a microphone onto, say, the upper track, and then you would bounce that upper track onto the lower track, and you could add in another source. So that second recording would have your first recording mixed in with the new one, sound on sound. It was pretty clever, really, for the time. But then what we could do is we could take that recording with 2 tracks and we could bounce it back to the other track. And of course, when you did that, you completely obliterated the original, so you had to get it right first time. There's no going back and redoing it. Once you'd erased that original track, it's gone for good. But that's how we worked. In the main, though, we used them to record stereo on, or at least 2 separate tracks at the same time. And they were great machines. Then I got busier at work and I didn't do so much work at the theatre. So I lost access to that Ferrograph 722. And I sort of regretted that. It was a nice machine. So in my radio and electronics firm, we had lots of hi-fi equipment which we used to sell and fix. And one thing we had sitting on the shelf for quite a long time was the successor to the Ferrograph Series 7, which was a Super 7. a much posher machine that did take 10-inch reels. And the Super 7 was lovely, still mechanical, still very mechanical. A big rotary lever that you turned. One position said wind. No, it didn't say rewind or fast wind. It just said wind. And on the opposite side of the machine was a rotary knob. And if you turned it anti-clockwise, it rewound. If you then turned it the other way, it went fast forward. And so you could actually jog backwards and forwards with one knob. So you stick the machine into wind, and then you set the direction or the speed of the wind on the other knob. And it worked pretty well. The Series 7 had that feature. The Super 7 carried it on. The Super 7 was pretty similar. The one we had at work was a 2-track machine, and it was a high speed, but it also had Dolby. Now at the time, Dolby Labs were doing really well with noise reduction for domestic users on cassettes, and they put Dolby B onto this Ferrograph. Part of the agreement with Ferrograph that Dolby had was that they would switch it out for 15 inch per second. It was figured that 15 inch per second was a professional recording speed, and so it wouldn't be right to have a domestic noise reduction system on 15 inch per second. So once you set that on the speed control, it dropped Dolby out. Not for long, I hasten to add, because most of us just simply linked out that on the switch, so that when it was on 15 inch per second, we could, if we wanted, have Dolby. Frankly, it wasn't that important. The noise figures on those machines were so much better than cassettes that we had at the time. So you don't really need Dolby on 15 inch per second, but if you had it, it was nice. The only thing, of course, was that you were very unlikely to find any other studios who had anything other than Ferrographs who would be able to cope with receiving a tape recorded at 15 inch per second, stereo, half track, on 1/4 inch tape that had Dolby on. So it wasn't really that useful feature that we had. But anyway, it worked. Ferrograph was still getting a bit of hassle from people about the fact that all the machines were mechanical. The good thing about them, of course, is with a screwdriver and a small toolbox, you could fix practically everything. All the electronics were discrete components. There were no real ICs of the time. So it was lots and lots of components, and they were laid out fairly sparsely on the board. So most things were quite fixable. But they wanted to move forward with the operation because things like Revox were doing really well with a few push buttons. So if you wanted to stop, you pushed it, it went clunk and it stopped. You put it into play and the machine played. This still took you turning a knob on a Ferrograph, which was deemed a little bit old-fashioned. So Ferrograph came up with a Logic 7. We did have one for a very short period of time, I think around about 1978, 79, that sort of era. And really, it was the Super 7 machine, and they'd just put onto it a Logic panel. There were actually like a whole bunch of relays inside the machine that did the functions that turning the old mechanical knob did. So when you pushed the button on the front that said play, there was a very loud clunk inside, and the machine knew that it had to stop rewinding, go into play mode, and these relays were just a very simple logic circuit so that you could only engage one thing at a time. You couldn't put it into rewind and play at the same time. The little logic circuit with the relays prevented that. And it worked, it was fine. They added a little mute button that prevented you getting the as the tapes went across. I never bothered with that, left it off. It's quite nice hearing that noise, you knew where you were. But eventually, like all things, I moved on and soon discovered digital ways of recording. I mean, we went through a few things to get to it, of course. I mean, we went through Sony's ill-fated L cassette for a time, a sort of chunky cassette that ran at 3 3/4. It was a 4-track, so you could turn it over. But L cassette never caught on, and things started to creep onwards. And bit by bit, they got better. We started to dally with video recorders, of course, at that time. And Sony came along with an F1 version of a Betamax, which let you record digital audio onto a Betamax videotape. So you actually had your small Betamax recorder and another little box the same size with a big chunky multi-core cable between the two. and you could record digits onto Betamax tape. That became popular, really popular with the recording people. The big firms who were recording classical music soon latched onto the idea that they could record digitally. They loved it. So we started to move on, and the old Logic 7 got put away and forgotten about. Eventually I left the company, moved on to doing other things, and I rather missed that tape recorder. It was rather nice. Hence this story. I saw on eBay somebody selling a Logic 7. It worked, but there was a problem. Ferrograph made a mistake back in the 70s, and they made a whole batch of their tape recorders, starting with the original Series 7, the Super 7s, and then the Logic 7s. They made them with dodgy rubber. Now, the story about Ferrograph dodgy rubber is all over the internet. You can search it out and read some really strange stories. But essentially, after a period of time, the rubber in the pinch wheels, the internal idlers, that sort of stuff, went sticky. I'd heard the stories loads and loads of times. In the 70s, I'd never experienced it. All mine were fine. The rubber seemed to be perfectly normal rubber. I had no problems with it whatsoever. But over the years, I've seen lots of stories that said, Ferrographs and their dodgy rubber. Well, this particular advert for the Logic 7 that I saw said it didn't have the rubber pinch wheel. The pinch wheel being the small rubber device that pushes the tape up against the capstan, squeezes the tape between the capstan and the rubber wheel, and that's what pulls the tape along at your 7.5 or 15 inch per second, whatever it is. And it said there wasn't one. And that sort of rang a bell as probably, I wonder if it's one of those sticky ones. Did the rubber go a bit gooey? And they've sort of taken the wheel off to get it fixed and never done it. I mean, so basically the machine worked, the tape shuttled backwards and forwards, but when you pressed play, nothing happened because there was no rubber wheel to push the tape against the capstan. So I figured it was worth a go. It wasn't too much money. I mean, by modern standards, it was a sensible amount of money, I suppose. But for a sort of vintage machine with a bit of kudos to it, I figured I could soon source myself a roller. I'd seen a few things on internet forums where it said there's a guy called Terry who makes rubber, and he's in America. And basically you can send things that need new rubber belts, new rubber drive wheels to him, and he will make you new ones. So I knew I could get a source in America, but I figured there's probably quite a few spares about. So I went and got it. And sure enough, everything worked. Everything sort of span that should spin. The reels worked. The torqued, the two rewind and supply reels, they worked. So it was good. The only thing missing was the rubber. The centre of the pulley was there. The brass bit in the middle was actually still attached to the machine, but no sign of the rubber. So I guess at some point it went sticky and whoever owned it before got rid of it. The guy who's selling it was selling it on behalf of his sort of elderly father who didn't seem to know much about the history. He mentioned he'd got a couple of these things, and this was advertised as the 2-track quarter-inch machine with the amplifiers and high speed. And when I got it home, I looked a bit more carefully and discovered that what I'd actually brought home was a 4-track. It was also not a high-speed machine. It took me a little while to confirm that, because obviously I couldn't put a tape on it because I didn't have that rubber wheel. So I had to go back to the ancient old maths and work out what the diameter of the capstan actually was, and try and do the maths to work out how many rotations a second it would have to do to drag it through at a certain speed. And when I did the maths, I soon realised that one of the speeds was 1 7/8, which meant it was a 3-speed slow machine. It was also a 4-track. It's not the end of the world, but I didn't want a 4-track, I wanted a 2-track. And the advert very clearly said 2-track high speed, and it wasn't. He said, "Oh, I've given you the wrong one." So I went back got the other machine, and I'd had the 4-track here in the office for about a week while we arranged a time for me to go all the way. It was quite a journey. It was about 200 miles. So we arranged it, and the guy said, I'm really sorry and everything, and he covered my fuel costs. I don't think he did anything devious. It was just one of those things. He had 2 machines. He didn't know that there was a label on the machine. Unfortunately, it's hidden under a rather awkward handle that these machines have got. And the handle has a tendency to be pushed inside. And once it does, you can't actually read the label that's underneath it. And getting the handle up is a bit of a tortuous thing to do, because it always drops just a little bit lower than it should. You have to prise it out with a screwdriver, and then the handle pops up. Another one of these British design features. But the handles always used to get stuck like that, so that didn't bother me in the least. But I'd got a 4-track. I decided to go back and get the 2-track. The 4-track is now in someone else's home doing good service, I think. Somebody else wanted a 4-track, so the 4-track's gone. I had it for less than a week, and it's now doing service for somebody else. And I went back to get the 2-track that I originally wanted, to discover that when I turned it on, the motor didn't go round. Everything else worked. It rewound, it fast forwarded, made all the right clunks and bunks. The lights all came on, everything worked, apart from the fact that the capstan didn't rotate. The guy was off in the kitchen making a cup of coffee. So I said, look, something's adrift here, and I got a couple of Allen keys and pulled the front panel off, to discover a huge mess. Inside these machines there is a stepped pulley on the flywheel. Flywheel is a big heavy metal thing, and it's got 3 different diameter drums. There's an idler wheel that makes contact with each one, so as you set 15 inches per second, it selects one of the diameter pulleys and they rub against each other. The capstan speeds up and Bob's your uncle, and it's done. Each one of these stepped surfaces on the flywheel has a rubber insert that the wheels rub against. What was inside the machine was patently proof that it had been stored horizontally, because the rubber had run off the pulleys. There was a puddle of what looks like black tar. You know, the sort of gungy stuff that you might fix a roof if it's leaking with. Sort of black, sticky, tar-like, impossible to get off your fingers when you prod it. And over the years, the rubber had turned into this tarry mess and had dripped off onto the chassis plate that's underneath it. Absolutely unfixable, I think. I'm sure the guy in America could possibly have rebuilt new rubber onto it. I mean, you'd have to sort of basically form the rubber on it and then rub the rubber right down. That would be a mammoth task. And the price for one of his capstan rollers with the postage would be getting on for about £85 to get just a rubber small one fixed, as it has to go to America. He then rebuilds it and then he sends it back to the UK. The idea of sending a heavy flywheel that's got 3 massive rubber rings on it would just be totally uneconomic. So the upshot is I came home. So instead of making a video for you today that has, this is what my new Ferrograph reel-to-reel tape recorder sounds like, you've got nothing, bar a few pictures. Now, what I'm saying is, if you see one of these things for sale, they are excellent recorders. I really wanted one, partly for nostalgic reasons, but because they are really good recorders, and they are quite reliable. If they do go wrong, they're relatively easy to fix because they are mechanical beasts, and the electronic boards are pretty easy to fix. And most of the components are still available, or at least modern versions of the old components. So they are something that an enthusiast can get going, but not when you've got the sort of amount of parts required that this one needed. Now, there are a few parts available. If you look on eBay or you Google and things like that, you can find the rubber idler wheels inside. They're actually used to select each one of the 3 speeds. There's a few of those I've seen available. You can get a capstan roller. I've discovered a guy in Italy, really nice guy, who can supply those. There's obviously Terry in America who can supply the rubber parts too, at a cost, plus shipping, tax, all those usual nasties. But it really means if you need anything other than a very simple set of idler wheels, you are not going to get these parts. They're no longer on the shelf. And even worse, if they are on someone's shelf and they get them off after 20 or 30 years, the chances are inside the packet is going to be a pile of goo rather than solid rubber. It's just a mistake that Ferrograph made in the 70s. The Logic machine that I bought was, I think, 1979 on a plate inside the machine. So we're looking at 70s Ferrographs. If you see one of those, be a little worried. Ferrograph by the end of the 70s was actually Neil Ferrograph. They did a little bit of merging with another company. Neil are the people who make the tape recorders that have been used in British police stations ever since the 70s. The ones you see in all the old movies that you put 2 cassettes in, you press a button and the machines go beep. And once they go beep, they're recording what you say. And at the end of the interview, the police keep one of the tapes and they give the other tape to you, so you know it's not been tampered with. They now make modern electronic versions of these, but the basic machine is the same. And Ferrograph merged with those. So from the late 70s, Logic series really, you'll start to see that the brand name on the label says Neil Ferrograph. So I don't have a good end result for this one. Episode 41 should be about how wonderful Ferrograph Series 7s, Super 7s, Logic 7s are, and probably why you should buy one of those and not buy a Revox or a Studer. With hindsight, I'm now thinking that I'm not going to try and source another one. There seems no point in now looking for a machine that has no spare parts available, which is a bit sad. Or at least the spare parts are available but horrendously priced. It does look like if you find a Series 7, unless someone has put new rubber on it sometime in the last 30 years, you're on borrowed time. Because if it's got that original rubber, and even if it appears to be good, there's a pretty decent chance that that rubber is going to die on you and turn into a really nasty sticky mess. We used to talk about sticky tape. Tape that used to shed its surface and go... Same sort of problem. A chemical formulation that they got a bit wrong and there was an unexpected side effect. Well, there's been solutions to try and fix the sticky tape syndrome. You've got lots of firms who can bake them for you and then do a copy. If you've got a tape recorder that's got a sticky insides, that's not really a lot of use to you. And I'd always wonder now that if I found one that was good, if I didn't use it much for one more year, would that be enough to turn what appeared to be a decent piece of rubber into a sticky mess? I really don't know. So I think for me, I've learnt a lesson. I've not come out of it badly. I've not lost any money or anything. But what I haven't got is the tape recorder that I really wanted. Someone's got a nice 4-track now. That's fine. I didn't want a 4-track. I wanted a half-track and I didn't get it. And that's just a real shame. So that's the moral of the tale. If anybody offers you a Ferrograph, be very careful. Double check absolutely everything. And I really would advise taking that front panel off. It's 6 small Allen screws. Pop them out. The front panel will come straight off. And you can have a look inside and you can touch all of those idler wheels and you can touch the flywheel with the 3 rubber surfaces. If they're dry and not sticky, and the capstan roller is okay, you're probably going to be good, because apart from that, there's a couple of belts. The brake mechanisms are not too bad at all. They're actually done by rods that you can adjust. So the rest of it is quite fixable, but not if the rubber is shot. And I seriously didn't believe that the sticky rubber that I'd read about on the internet was not sticky, it was almost liquid. That's my tale. So, sorry I can't let you hear a nice Ferrograph, but I can't, and I don't think I ever will be able to now. Hopefully, back soon with a video that's got a better outcome. Anyway, that's the Ferrograph video that I can't show you. I've showed you all the pictures. I've showed you things with little arrows pointing where if you get offered one of these things, you'll know where to look. But if someone offers you a Ferrograph, be very careful. I think with hindsight, they're probably best avoided now, unless you know where the spare parts can be got. And I don't think they're available anymore. Anyway, so that was episode 41. Slightly downbeat. I'm awfully sorry. I hoped it was going to be a nice one. But for once, didn't cost me any money, but I didn't get a tape recorder. Take care. See you on the next video.